Carol, can you hear me? Yeah, we can hear her though. One second, yeah. Okay.
Yes, I can. I had myself muted because I thought that was better.
Oh, that's great. Okay, thank you. Okay. All right. Okay, so that's Carol Christ from Berkeley. Welcome, everybody. We're going to start in a moment. We're waiting a little bit because after being evicted from the library, we switched rooms twice, and I want a little extra time for people to get here. So we're going to start at, we said we'd start about 10 after, so we'll start in 5 minutes so people can find their way here. Welcome, and I'm looking forward to this evening. It'll be a great, I think it's going to be a great session. Okay. So, Barbara, why don't you come here and help, we'll get ready to go with some of the songs. Yeah? We'll start with that. Yeah, why don't you come up front? Yeah, I'll get them. He's ready. Yep.
The only thing you have to do is check on grades and hit yes or whatever it said, like yes or need or whatever. You just hit that one. That's what happens.
So when you finish, come on, Carl. Where's Carly? Carly's going to do it too.
Yeah, we can do it. Sorry. Share the meeting. Okay, great.
Just wait about 2 more minutes.
Singing.
It's fine.
I'll be able to do good on this singing.
Oh, it doesn't matter. We're 3 people.
I've been doing this all the time. I can't sing to sing.
It doesn't matter.
Okay, great. But I think it's great. Thank you.
For to raise, there was a record that was used to raise funds for the free speech movement's defense when they were in a mass trial. So it's Bettina Aptheker, Carly Hoover, and Barbara Garson. And use the mics, okay?
Okay, you ready?
Ready?
Ready? Okay. 1, 2.
From the tip of San Diego to the top of Berkeley's hills, we have built a mighty factory to impart our social skills. Social engineering triumph, managers of every kind. Let us all with drills and homework manufacture human minds. Keep the students safe for knowledge, keep them loyal, keep them clean. This is why we have a college. Hail to IBM machine.
Good job. We did it. Yes. And we wore IBM cards that would so early that they were punch cards,
Okay.
not computer cards.
Okay. Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Robert Cohen, and I just want to set out the program for you and let's get us started. Do an introduction. I want to welcome you to this session on the Free Speech Movement 60th anniversary. It's called the Free Speech Movement at 60, the Free Speech Crisis 1964-2024. An exciting program awaits you, as you can already tell. As you can see from the session's agenda, you'll have the opportunity tonight to learn much about the free speech movement, one of the most successful student movements in American history, which won a historic victory for free speech rights on campus at Berkeley in December of 1964, when the Berkeley Academic Senate overwhelmingly voted in its December 8th resolutions to support the free speech demands of the free speech movement for unregulated speech and no restriction on the content of speech at Berkeley, which expanded political liberty on campus across 1960s America. Our first speakers, just going to outline the program for you, will be veterans of the student movement, Barbara Garson, who was editor of the Free Speech Movement newsletter, and Bettina Aptheker, a key figure of the movement, who served on the Free Speech Movement's leadership team on its steering committee. Barbara would go on to become a prominent playwright and author who wrote the popular anti-war play MacBird. Back in 1965, Barbara Garson wrote Mario and the Magician, a brief satirical dramatic piece which was enacted on Berkeley's Sproul Plaza to commemorate the first anniversary of the free speech movement in '65. Tonight it will be performed for the first time since 1965, and Barbara will do an introduction to it. The performance was made possible by the diligent work of Kay Hyman and Sidney Mazik and director Keith Huff of NYU's Educational Theater Program. That'll come in a few minutes. Following this performance, Bettina Aptheker, who has written insightfully about the free speech movement in her memoir, Intimate Politics, How I Grew Up Red, Fought for Free Speech, and Became a Feminist Rebel, will discuss her memories of the free speech movement and reflect on its significance. Next, we move from these free speech movement veterans to the Berkeley faculty's reflection on the free speech movement through a memorable poem by Berkeley English professor and poet Peter Dale Scott, which will be, it's called the Greek Theater, How Mario Savio Changed My Life. And this Peter Dale Scott poem will be read by NYU English professor and an accomplished poet and literary scholar, Lytle Shaw, who's over there. And moving beyond 1964, we will next hear via Zoom from Carol Christ, who served as UC Berkeley's chancellor from 2017 to 2024. Chancellor Christ will reflect on the legacy of the free speech movement and the status of free speech at Cal during her years as chancellor and really in our own time. Chancellor Christ was one of the few chief campus officers last semester who, in the name of free speech and preserving the legacy of the free speech movement, refused to have the anti-Gaza war protesters evicted from their encampment and arrested. Our final speaker, yes, you're here, yeah. Our final speaker, representing more than 3,000 anti-war protesters arrested last semester in nonviolent campus demonstrations, is NYU graduate student Anne-Marie Garcia Jardine, right here. She's a native of Austin, Texas. Anne-Marie was an undergraduate at the University of Texas last semester and will discuss the free speech crisis and the police invasion of the campus that she witnessed and experienced. Now, ordinarily in a session like this, I would, as a historian of American student protest, devote most of my remarks to introducing the free speech movement itself, as I did recently at a similar FSM 60 session out at Berkeley earlier this month, which was organized by Berkeley students and funded by the University of California Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. Out at Berkeley, that session went unhindered at a university that respects free speech and academic freedom, and it was a wonderful session featuring free speech movement activist Bettina Aptheker, Jack Rady, and Lynn Hollander-Salvio. Regrettably, however, NYU is no longer an institution like Berkeley that fully respects free speech and academic freedom. In fact, the NYU administration sought to censor this session, and actually, without my permission or knowledge, censored the online invitations to this event. I was told that unless I restricted the focus of this session to 1964 and deleted our discussion of the campus free speech crisis of today, 2024, NYU's library would end its co-sponsorship of our session, evict our session from the room we reserved in NYU Post Library, which you can tell we're not in here, remove the online invitation from its website, and break its agreement to stream this session. Of course, I refused to go along with this absurd censorship demand, which constituted a violation of my academic freedom and the free speech rights of every speaker and audience member in this session. It's not merely that it's unseemly and a terrible irony to censor and banish from the university library a free speech session. It's intellectual assault on my responsibility as a historian to assess the free speech movement's legacy and whether its free speech victory in 1964 has proved enduring, transient, or something in between. One cannot probe that legacy without exploring whether the free speech principles championed by the free speech movement are alive and well on college and university campuses in this year we mark as the movement's 60th anniversary. The attempt to censor this session, as well as the disciplinary cases against 180 plus pro-Palestinian students and faculty, which is alluded to in the headlines on the bottom of your program, the first page on the agenda, the mass arrest of nonviolent anti-war protesters last semester here at NYU, the weaponization of time, place, and manner regulations to inhibit student protest, the closing of the free speech area at NYU Student Union building, offer powerful evidence of the erosion of free speech on this campus. This is regrettably part of a national free speech crisis on campus. As you can see from the New York Times map on page 2 of your packet, right behind the agenda, is a map of more than 3,000 pro-Palestinian protesters were arrested last semester in demonstrations and encampments. 98% of these demonstrations were nonviolent, and the arrests so unjustified that in many cases, and probably most, the charges were dropped. This arrest rate last semester outpaces most of the era of the Vietnam War in the late 60s, when the protests were much more disruptive than those last semester. It appears that in a time of declining free speech, arresting students protesting on behalf of an unpopular cause has become a first rather than a last resort on many campuses. I view this as a really sad trend. Student movements often raise unpopular demands, and in their quest for justice, peace, and freedom, such movements challenge public policy in ways that upset the public, that upset rich university donors, business interests, and politicians, particularly on the right. American social conservatism makes much of the public hostile to student activism, since it leads to the assumption that students should defer to their elders, obey the rules, and not challenge the status quo. Much like politically vocal athletes like LeBron James, who are told to shut up and play, students are essentially told to shut up and study. And this has been the case no matter what the cause, whether it was the anti-racist lynch-cutter sit-ins of 1960, the freedom rides of 1961, the free speech movement of 1964, the anti-war movement during the Vietnam era. All public opinion polls show them to be deeply and overwhelmingly unpopular. And if you look at the last graphic, that is the last page of your program, the page 3, that's a compendium of San Francisco, mostly Hearst Press cartoons attacking the free speech movement. My favorite one is the one on the left, where you had a Trojan horse, looks like a beatnik type of goat or something, with a beard, that's, you got these students representing subversion and so forth, disobedience, moving in there like it's a Trojan horse, that free speech was a phony issue, which of course it was not. And so if you just think of all the democratic and humane change that would have prevented from happening, that these movements brought, like the desegregation of the lunch counters, interstate travel, the winning of free speech on campus, trying to end the Vietnam War, if those had been suppressed, a lot of important changes in America that made America a more democratic and humane society would not have happened, because student movements are just generally unpopular. Especially on the eve of a historic national election, the NYU administration's illiberalism is worrisome. The same NYU administration that banished our free speech session from its library honors John A. Paulson, naming its mammoth building, new building behind my apartment house, in his honor. Paulson, a hedge fund billionaire, hosted at his Palm Beach mansion an event that raised more than $50.5 million for the Trump campaign. As I'm sure you know, Trump very often used Nazi-like rhetoric to demonize non-white immigrants, and Trump's chief of staff characterized him as a fascist recently, who thought Hitler did some good things. In closing, let me suggest that the wrong people have been evicted from NYU's library. Instead of banishing our free speech session, the NYU administration should move its own executive offices out of Bope's library, maybe to office suites at the top of the Paulson Center, where its liberal, money-oriented leaders could be more appropriately housed. This might allow academic freedom to return to the library. And as a finishing touch, if I have my wish, I would hope over the library they'd inscribe words that would help to inspire students and faculty and all who come here to ideas that really represent what a university should stand for. And these are the words of the free speech movement's famed orator, Mario Savio, whose biography I wrote. And I'll close with this. On the free speech movement's 30th anniversary in 1994, Mario was quoted this way. Diogenes said, "The most beautiful thing in the world is the freedom of speech." And those words, Mario explained, those words are in me. They're burned in my soul. Because for me, freedom of speech was not a tactic, not something to win for political advantage. To me, freedom of speech represents the very dignity of what a human being is. That's what marks us off from the stones and the stars. You can speak freely. It's almost impossible for me to describe. It is a thing that marks us as just below the angels. Thank you. And Barbara Garson will now come in to introduce her Mario and the Magician.
Thank you. Where shall I stand?
Oh.
I understand there's some. Oh, well. Current student activists hearing about the Berkeley free speech movement 60 years ago, reading about it in Robert Cohen's books, must think, wow, what giants they were. 800 arrested. Mario dragged from the stage of the Greek theater, with thousands watching. Governor Reagan, or soon to be Governor Reagan, campaigning against the Berkeley rebels. Wow, they must think as they dig into the history, our predecessors were giants. Well, actually, if you look at the pictures of us coming through, say, the gate, whether on a march or just on any day of campus, you'll see that all the boys had short hair, all the girls had flared skirts and Peter Pan collars. Yes, we did. That's what we wore. Bettina and I, we wore Peter Pan collars too. And of course, we didn't just look like that. We were that. The beginning of the 60s weren't the 60s yet. And the students coming to Berkeley in the years before the free speech movement and coming in with us, they were probably mostly liberal. No, I'd say probably mostly apolitical. That would be truer. So we weren't the Berkeley rebels. And then what were we asking from the university, these Berkeley rebels? We weren't telling them how to use their endowment and what to divest from. We weren't telling them who they should hire. We weren't trying to tell them what they should teach. All we wanted was the First and 14th Amendment of the Constitution to apply to us on campus. And it had already applied because there was a little strip of sidewalk that we and the Berkeley police assumed to be public property, for which we applied for permits and set up tables, and all the groups, the campus religious groups, the young Democrats, the young Republicans, we all sat out there, and of course the core groups and the SNCC groups and so on. And then we came back one term and the university told us, hey, we were just informed that that is university property. You can't do any of that anymore. So basically what we and all the rest of the groups were asking them for was, well, if it's university property and it was used that way before and the university is a public place, once again, we want to use it that way. We don't want any special privileges. If we do something bad, like any citizen, you can arrest us. Come on. All we were asking for from the first moment to the last moment, these Berkeley rebels, was that the United States Constitution apply to us just as it had the last term on this little strip of public property. Can you imagine that? That is the free speech movement. It really was about free speech. Now, however, and we were, as I said, the students were mostly liberal. Now, I won't deny that there were a few socialists on campus, maybe even a real communist, maybe one. I wouldn't have asked then because remember, we're closer to the McCarthy red baiting period than we are to the 60s as you remember them. So I wouldn't have asked then, and it would be irrelevant to ask now. But there were us on the campus, a few of us, And when these bans came down, we did in pamphlets and booklets remind people that this really wasn't started to get the sororities and the religious groups away from the front of the campus. This happened because the Board of Regents of the state of California owned half of the Board of Regents of our university owned half the state. Well, actually, they actually sent their wives. The Board of Regents didn't have it had Mrs. Chandler, it had Mrs. Hearst, it didn't, but they were the people that owned the state. So there we were trying to inform our students that this is happening because of the movements that are big right now. They don't want the civil rights movement telling them who to hire in the places they own. They don't want the farm workers telling them, the farm workers union, New Cesar Chavez union, telling them what to pay and what protections to put in the field from chemicals. By the way, I was much more involved with the farm workers than the civil rights movement at the beginning of the free speech movement. And I do still believe that while the tactics of the civil rights movement inspired us, that at least for the Board of Regents, the farm workers union, farm workers action was very important. Anyway, I was involved with that. However, neither of us, civil rights, farm workers, with all our wonderful educated propaganda, we were not what radicalized the campus. What radicalized most students, as far as I can tell, was being lied to. Remember, this was a time of, what do they call it, in loco parentis? You came to campus, but the university administration were your parents on campus. And we were just young, decent, liberal people, and you don't expect your parents to lie to you. But time after time, they invited us to join committees that didn't really exist, and we fell for it. We always, we were very naive, and they lied to us. And so we had a full term, before we did anything that before you heard, no, not before you heard about us, but we spent the whole year, they spent the whole year radicalizing us, while we every day would come out and put out leaflets and try to explain exactly the truth of what happens in our negotiation about that little strip. They would lie. They would negotiate with us and then expel the people they were negotiating with. I mean, it was unbelievable, and it took them a full term to do it. And by the end of that term, they had educated the whole campus. Now, and at the end of the year, well, at the beginning of the next year, we had a memorial ceremony on the steps of Sproul Hall, where we had rallies almost every day about the free speech movement. Very peaceful, very orderly. I never have been a part of anything since where people were really listening to see what we could do, instead of people shoving and trying to be the student leader, because there wasn't such thing as a student leader. There were problems, and we really faced them. So we had these, at the end of the year, we had, well, after our complete and total 100% victory, namely that the First and 14th Amendment applied on campus, but also that we had learned an awful lot, I decided to write this little skit for the end of a memorial. And what I would do in this little skit, it began with Mario facing, it's called Mario and the Magician. Mario is Mario, and the magician is Clark Kerr, the president of the whole university system of the University of California, who called himself the captain of the bureaucracy. I didn't make up that name for him. He called himself the captain of the bureaucracy, and he explained that he had to keep the ship steady and not let anybody rock the boats, and not be in favor of one thing or another, but all the different interests, the Defense Department with the radiation lab, the agricultural people, he had to keep the ship balanced. And he had that job, and he was very good at it. He really did almost keep us from rocking the boat for a whole year, because we were very naive and responded to every offer to hear a committee or go someplace. So I wrote this little skit at the end of the year, after we'd been through this for a whole year. And it's just Mario, it's just 5 minutes, 4 minutes of going through what we went through, with Mario first hearing that there comes a time that you can't do that, and he's outraged. And then we go step by step through these committees very naively. They call us the Berkeley Rebels, but we knew who we were. Very naively, step to step through it until, and I had the microphone, an actor. I had huge puppets, big, the 10 feet tall puppets that one person runs each hand and another person runs the back. And so we would just go through that year of them lying and us telling the truth, and come to the end, and I had planned it so that, and at the end, the real Mario Savio, the audience that's out there, suddenly hears the real Mario Savio's voice on recording, saying the same thing. Suddenly he's gone round in a full circle and nothing has happened. And there comes a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart, and these big ugly puppets are saying that. And we go straight into Joan Baez singing "How Many Roads Must a Man Walk Down" as we walk into the building, which is, of course, how I remembered it. Very moving. So I said to the people sitting up front, we're in Sproul Hall, big steps, big plaza, the crowd going back to about the fountain. We used to have a count, maybe it wasn't accurate, but we'd say up to the fountain was a 2,000 crowd. Behind the fountain was a 5,000 crowd. Remember, this is 27,000 students, of which I would say more than 50% played an active role, did something more than just hang around at our rallies. Certainly they all came to, there were rallies of 10,000. So I said to the people at the front of the steps, I said, when this puppet show ends, this puppet is going to walk into the building. You few here, and I only said that to maybe 15 people, you few here follow it to make a visual for the rest of the people so they can, it was hiring extras basically for free. You come in and you do that. And so it happened. And we came to the end of the speech and Mario talks. And then what happened was the people did what I asked them to do. And everybody else followed. And not only they didn't rush to the door, they went in that serpentine line that the puppet had started. And for it must have been close to an hour, they went slowly, whatever their numbers were, 2,000, 3,000, into the building. And I was like crazy. I kept running over to the people at the mics, keep playing. How many roads must a man walk down? I mean, how many times can we play How Many Roads? But it kept going on for like an hour. It was so gorgeous. I mean, in fact, remember that there's a they went up to the second floor. I don't know how they choreographed it. There was nobody inside. The people went up to the second floor. So they went across the big open windows with you all see them from the outside. And I remember at one point, a guy came out of the balcony and said, come on in, come on in. I said, oh no, we don't need that. That's awful. This is so beautiful. We don't need him going anything vulgar like that. But I had no more control, but he did go back in. So we watched for 45 minutes as that all happened. So my first play had a cast of thousands. And this play, by the way, I mean, this is a little embarrassing. I am very grateful for Robbie. He dug out of the Free Speech archives 4 typewritten pages, actually 1 on each side, maybe 2 pages typed on each side, from a typewriter with broken keys that I recognized, and all little handwritten corrections on it. And he dug that up. And I am very grateful to him for digging it up. I'm a little embarrassed about putting it on. It worked because we knew who we were. It worked because it was true. It worked for us. I'm a little afraid. I don't see how it can work for you. I mean, I don't expect that you'll watch this little skit 5-minute skit. And then all rise up together and go back to the library and demand that we speak there. It's not going to move you that way. I don't know what it's going to do. But anyway, I thank Robbie for digging out, and whatever, we'll see what we see.
Okay. All right. So we will now have Mario and the Magician.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. You've got to put your bodies upon the wheels and upon the gears, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all. Just a minute. Now, what do you want, Dr. Curl?
It's not what I want. My job is to find out what you want. What do you people want?
Freedom.
Uh-huh. And when do you want it?
Now.
Okay. Roman numeral 1, freedom. Roman numeral 2, now. I suppose you know that what you're asking for is in conflict with the historic policy of the university. Nevertheless, I will use my personal influence to see that your demands receive the careful consultation of the appropriate authorities.
Well, at last we've gotten through to them. At last something's happening. Somebody's listening.
I'm happy to announce that the university is prepared to meet you people halfway. As you remember, your demands fell into 2 distinct parts, freedom and now. As to the freedom part, I am fully in sympathy with this. In fact, I have myself on many occasions urged the university to establish a research foundation to study the introduction of freedom to the university, perhaps on an experimental basis, an hour or so every week as a beginning. Unfortunately, I have been advised that the state constitution specifically forbids any freedom on this campus. And so I just can't do anything about the first part of your request. As to your second demand, which was, as I recall it, now, I'm happy to say that I've gotten the authorities to agree completely. So please disperse this mob, please disperse this assembly now. According to our agreement, of course.
But this is ridiculous. Outlandish, shameful, scandalous, hypocritical, horrendous.
What's the matter, young man?
You can't separate it like that. It's one demand. Freedom now, indivisible with liberty and justice for all.
I think it would be tragic if the reasonable negotiations we have been conducting should break down because of semantic quibbles.
You've given us absolutely nothing. We're staying right here. We shall not be moved.
You realize that by your intransigence, you're jeopardizing all the gains that you've made. Nevertheless, in the interest of harmony, I will confer again with the authorities. I hope you appreciate what I've done. I really went out on a limb for you people.
Well, what happened?
On my recommendation, the highest authorities have agreed to establish a committee.
A committee? We've won!
A committee composed of all interested parties to examine this entire question. I don't mind telling you that the authorities are prepared to initiate the most sweeping liberalizations.
Sweeping liberalizations?
Especially in the area of substantive procedural due process. Now, since I have a great deal of experience as a negotiator, and since I know how to deal with the authorities, I speak their language, so to speak, I would suggest that you allow me to negotiate on your behalf. Now, do you have a list of specifics that I can present to the authorities?
We've whittled everything down to these 4.
Uh-huh. A, B, C, and D. As a trained negotiator, I would suggest the following strategy. If you show your good faith by giving up A, then you're sure to get B, C, and D.
Well, if there's no other way.
I assure you, this is the way it's always done. You can trust me. I just want to give a progress report. Things are going beautifully. I've spoken to the more liberally inclined of the authorities, and they've assured me that if you give up B, then they can get C and D for you. But I'll be right back. There's another negotiating session. Well, it's in the bag.
What's in the bag?
Why, it's D, of course. You didn't expect to get both C and D, did you? You've got to be willing to bargain, to compromise, to accommodate.
I'll take anything. Let's see the bag.
Actually, it's not in the bag quite yet. I have assurances, however, that as soon as this mob is dispersed, we will make immediate arrangements to establish a committee to...
Ridiculous, outlandish, shameful, scandalous, hypocritical, horrendous.
I am frankly shocked by your behavior. We have shown patience, reasonableness, tolerance, and decency. I'm saddened to say we have received nothing in return but intolerance, intransigence, and irrationality. These outbursts only jeopardize the great gains, the sweeping liberalizations achieved by my efforts on your behalf. Any further demonstration can only hurt your cause.
The time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
I invite him to address the assembly.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful performance.
Thank you.
Great job, guys. Great. Next speaker will be Bettina Aptheker. If you give up A, B, and C, we will give you D, okay?
Thank you so much. It's very hard for me to see Mario and not cry. Just sort of burst into tears, you know. He was a great friend, a great friend, and a remarkable leader. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you, Robbie, for organizing this. And despite all of the machinations of NYU, all of you got in. It's really great. So Barbara did a beautiful job of talking about some of the background for the free speech movement. And I wanted to just emphasize a few points briefly. And the first is, and I think she said it very clearly also, that most of us who, she mentioned the farm workers, which I was also involved with a little later, but many of us who are involved in the free speech movement were directly involved in the civil rights movement, including having been in the South in the previous summer of '64. And some of us had been involved in a committee to end discrimination. There was a large coalition called the Committee to End Discrimination in San Francisco, which had organized protests to end discriminatory practices in the hotel industry, which is one of the places I was arrested. And we actually won that struggle. And the hotel industry signed an agreement with us that they would henceforth hire people of color, especially Black people, in every category, in every job category. It's like it was an affirmative action before affirmative action existed. And we did the same thing with the auto row industry. You know, on Van Ness Avenue in San Francisco, there's all these auto showrooms, and all of the salespeople there were white and men. And all the janitorial staff were people of color, Black people. And we insisted that they desegregate, and we won an agreement there. And then it was the summer, and then we came back in the fall, and we took on the Bank of America. Why not? And we were pointing out that the Bank of America was discriminating in exactly the same way, and that all the higher positions, the managerial positions, and even the clerical positions, you know, when the tellers and so forth were all white, and not all men, but largely men, and that there were no, again, people of color or black people in any positions like that. And it was when we did that it was suddenly discovered, as Barbara correctly pointed out, that strip of sidewalk where we had always conducted our protests and tables had gone up and that we thought belonged to the city of Berkeley, all of a sudden we were told that strip of sidewalk belonged to the regents of the University of California. And indeed, there was a placard. There is a placard there. You can go and see it. It's like a historic placard. And it says, property of the regents of the University of California. The ban on freedom of speech at the University of California had existed at least since 1934 general strike by the Longshoremen Workers Union. So it wasn't new. The ban was not new. And they also banned any speakers from coming to campus. Let's say Robbie wanted to invite someone to come to campus. I'm not talking about NYU now, but I'm talking about back then. And as, for example, Professor Kenneth Stamp in the history department wanted to invite my father to speak for the history department. Well, my father was a rather notorious communist. And when Kenneth Stamp, who was a very esteemed historian at the time, made the invitation, he was told in no uncertain terms by both the department and also the administration that my father could not speak on the campus. And so Kenneth Stamp moved the talk across the street from the campus to a place called Pless Hall, where it was held, and he gave a lecture on African American history, which is what his field was. Those were the times. Those were the days. That was how the enforcement of anti-communist speakers bans, the McCarthy, the remnants of the loyalty oaths from the McCarthy period and so forth. That's the context. So you have this twofold context, which is the repression of freedom of speech and academic freedom, and the tailspin from the loyalty oaths that people had been forced to sign. And Clark Kerr was one of the people that had come in to try to make a reconciliation so that professors that had been fired could be rehired. So that's going on, you see, at the same time. And then us, I don't know, we're not really rebels yet. You're right about that. But then we came along and said, well, we don't want these regulations anymore. We want freedom of speech. And I think Barbara's also really correct, which is it was very conservative demand. The First and 14th Amendment is not exactly revolutionary. It's like foundational. Freedom of the press, freedom of association, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion. Although these days in the United States, you really have to remind people of what the First Amendment is about. So that was the foundation. And I just, a couple of other things I wanted to say, I have my notes. When the police arrested Jack Weinberg, so we had a meeting, you know, to figure out what to do. And I remember Mario at the meeting saying, well, look, if the principle is freedom of speech, you know, he was a very principled man. If the principle is freedom of speech, why don't we just move the tables onto the center of Sproul Hall Plaza? Because we don't just want that little strip. We want the First Amendment on the entire campus. So we moved the tables to the center of Sproul Hall Plaza, right in front of the administration building. Of course, we allowed for pedestrian traffic. We did not try to block entrances. We were very, very polite about it. And one of the tables that was set up was of the Congress of Racial Equality. And it was, and the person sitting at it was a civil rights activist whose name was Jack Weinberg, who had recently been a graduate student in mathematics. To our complete astonishment, and I will tell you, I was in the plaza, standing there, and to my complete astonishment, a police car drove up onto the center of Sproul Hall Plaza at 12 noon when thousands of students were pouring out of class. The timing, what were these people thinking? And they arrested Jack. And they put him in the police car. And I was standing just in front of the front bumper where I could see the driver, I could see the police officer. He had gotten into the car and he had turned on the ignition. I watched him turn on the ignition and someone shouted, "Sit down." I don't know who shouted it. And so I sat down because we're trained in nonviolence. Someone tells you to sit down, you sit down. And pretty soon there were hundreds of us around the police car. And I remember him flipping his cap back a little bit. You know, he had his cap on and he flipped it back like that. And he turned off the ignition. And he pulled out the key and he picked up his radio and he called for reinforcements. We held the car for 32 hours. If you're interested, Jack peed in a Coke bottle. I don't know what would have happened if a woman had been arrested. I have no insight into that. He was a very disciplined man. He conducted himself admirably. At one point, he wanted to speak from the top of the police car. We were speaking from the top of the police car with permission from the police. Mario always asked for permission. Can we speak from the top of the car? He said, "Oh, yes." The officer said, "Would you please take off your shoes?" So we took off our shoes and we climbed up onto the top of the police car. So at one point, Jack wanted to speak and he asked the officer and he said, "I won't run away." And the officer said, "I know you won't." And so Jack came out of the car and he climbed up onto the top and he made a speech. And then he climbed back down and got back in the car because he was under arrest. So that we held the car for 32 hours. There were negotiations and committees were set up. Right? Committees were set up, some of which did not exist, but of course we did not know that. And we ended peacefully. And there was a Joan Baez concert that night in the Greek Theater. And we all went to hear Joan Baez, who sang beautifully in the Greek Theater. And that was the end of that initial protest. Afterwards, that weekend, we had a meeting. And we formed what then became called the Free Speech Movement. We hadn't named ourselves yet. And we became the Free Speech Movement. Meanwhile, Clark Kerr, whom you've now met, issued a statement in which he said 49% of the demonstrators were communists or communist sympathizers. That was the front headline on the San Francisco Examiner newspaper. And Mario slapped his knee at the meeting with glee, and he said, "I know what we're going to do. Bettina is going to speak at the next rally because she's the only real communist we know." And that is the only reason that I somehow emerged as a leader of this thing. And so I spoke and, well, yes. And I liked it. I liked it. I loved working with Mario. I loved working with all of our beautiful students and everyone who was involved in the movement. I want to just note that just like right now, 1964 was a presidential election year. It was Goldwater versus Johnson. And it was also a proposition on the California ballot called Proposition 14, which was a proposition to repeal the first fair housing law that had ever been passed in California, in fair housing law. And I want to tell you that we were all fired up to try to defeat that no on 14 so that fair housing would prevail. And I will just tell you, fast forward, we lost that. The state of California repealed fair housing in that election. In any event, let me just say this was a couple of other things. We had a very, very broad coalition. The only principle for joining the free speech movement was you believed in the First Amendment. That's all. It didn't matter what your political affiliation was, your religious tradition, anything else. We had a very, very broad coalition of students and student organizations. We had an executive committee with 2 representatives from every organization that wished to affiliate with us. And then eventually we formed something called the Independents because there were a lot of independent students on the campus that weren't affiliated with anybody, including religious organizations. And they elected 7 representatives at their mass meetings. And then we elected from the executive committee, we elected a steering committee, of which I was a member. And then from the steering committee, we elected 4 of us, I think it was 4 of us, to be on the negotiating committee with the administration, which I was also. So I have a lot of history, a lot of experience with all of this, none of which I'm going to go into now. It's just, that was just part of what took place. And after a lot of frustration, the administration decided just around Thanksgiving, again, really stupid. I'm sorry, they just weren't very bright about this. I think they really underestimated what was happening. I think they didn't understand what was happening. They decided to undertake disciplinary action against 4 or 5 of the students from the initial protest at the police car, which they had promised not to do. And as soon as they did that, Mario and the steering committee and the executive committee issued an ultimatum. You have until December 2nd at 12 noon to withdraw that disciplinary action, or we will occupy Sproul Hall. Of course, they didn't withdraw, and we occupied Sproul Hall. Every moment of space of Sproul Hall, from the 4th floor to the basement. And it was very carefully organized. The study area was on the 4th floor, and there were classes held on the 3rd floor. And if you wanted to go down to the basement, you could have a Hanukkah service down at the basement, Hanukkah celebration, organized by a man named Michael Lerner, who later in life became a rabbi and who published the magazine called Tikkun, which in Hebrew means to heal the world. So that was the sit-in. And then the chancellor arrived at 3 a.m. and he said, this is an illegal assembly. And if you don't disperse, you will be arrested. And he said, you have materially impaired the work of the university, to which he received the loudest applause. Since that, of course, had been the intention. And so the arrests proceeded starting at about 3 a.m. I think I was arrested about 9 a.m. on Thursday morning. December 2nd was Wednesday, December 3rd was a Thursday. And about 9 a.m. I was arrested. I was bailed out by Professor Kenneth Stamp. And I must say to you that there were over 800 arrests. It was the largest peacetime arrest in the history of the United States up until that point. And the faculty bailed us out. And we were in Santa Rita, which was it's a jail. And we had been taken to Santa Rita. And the line of cars of faculty waiting to bail us out was 2 miles long outside the gates of the prison. It was extraordinary. And this also tells you that the faculty began to swing in our favor. And it also tells you that despite the arrests, the students, the graduate students, went out on strike. Many faculty wrote on their blackboards, "We will not teach while police are on our campus." The Teamsters refused to cross the picket line. The Central Labor Council of Alameda County didn't sanction the strike, but it supported the strike. And we also had the support of the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union. And it was after that, and there was a huge rally on Friday, December 4th, which I missed because I was still in jail, where many, many civil rights leaders came and supported us. It was huge. And then after that, Clark Kerr tried to regroup. And we, meanwhile, were organizing among the faculty over the weekend. And there was a historic meeting of the Academic Senate. I'm skipping December 7th, but I should say that on December 7th, there was an extraordinary convocation in the Greek Theater. And Kerr made his speech. And it was supposedly conciliatory, but it granted nothing. And Mario, at the end of the speech, walked up to get onto the stage of the Greek Theater. I was just behind him. And all he wanted to do was announce to the 20,000 assembled there that the free speech movement would issue its response in Sprout Hall Plaza, and to come down to Sprout Hall Plaza. And as he stepped onto the microphone, he was grabbed from behind by several police officers, including by the throat, and dragged from the microphone, which again was, I mean, the leader, you take the leader of the free speech movement and you grab him by the throat and you pull him back from the microphone. And pandemonium broke out in the Greek Theater. And I remember me and Art Goldberg, and I think the other guy was Sander Fuchs, who was also a leader. We stood up on the stage of the Greek Theater, and we didn't want people to riot, so we started a chant, "Let him speak, let him speak, let him speak, let him speak," which was taken up by the crowd. And then they let him come to the microphone. He said what I just said, "Come down to Sprout Hall Plaza and we'll give our response." And then we raced down to the plaza. On Tuesday, December 8th, the next day, there was this extraordinary meeting of the Academic Senate in which there was a debate by the professors on the meaning of freedom of speech. And it was magnificent. And they set up speakers outside Wheeler Auditorium so we could listen to what was being said. And speaker after speaker, in my memory, got up and talked with great passion about the meaning of the Constitution, the meaning of freedom of speech, and the meaning of academic freedom. These were professors, all white, almost all male. This is 1964. And they finished, and then the vote was called for. And the vote was 824 in favor of a resolution supporting the free speech movement, 824, 115 opposed. And that was it. That was the overwhelming faculty vote. And then they emerged through the doors of Wheeler Auditorium, and there were thousands of us outside. And we parted to make an aisle for them and started to applaud. And many of these, sometimes elderly white men, were weeping as they came out of the auditorium, as were we, because I think they understood that in that moment, with this great movement of thousands and thousands of people, we had finally crushed McCarthy and McCarthyism. And a week later, the regents of the university said, henceforth, their regulations would not go beyond the First and 14th Amendments to the United States Constitution. And then we wrote Christmas carols, which is what we started with when we were singing before. And regulations changed regulations swept the country. Mario and I and others toured the country afterwards, just in the next few weeks. And no matter where we went, I was at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I think I was at Queens College, and it didn't matter where I went. I hadn't said anything. You'd come onto the stage, and there'd be thousands of students in the audience, and they'd start to cheer, just cheer. And you could see it was a wave. There was just a wave as it swept over this country. A wave which I hope, with great fervor, we will reproduce, maintain in 2024, and reestablish the rights of freedom of speech on this campus and on every campus in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bettina. As a kind of a coda to that, I just mentioned that when they took Mario off the stage, they were dragging him by his tie, and that he was wearing a tie says something. But at the FSM's victory rally the next day, Hal Draper, it was Mario's birthday, awarded him a pull-off tie, so the police couldn't get him. So anyway, I'm really excited to hear this poem that Lionel Shaw is going to read by Peter Del Scott. Gives a faculty perspective. The line in it that most got to me was that he went from being a classicist to an activist in the 60s. And this poem also was very unusual. It had footnotes in it, including my biography of Mario. So I was very taken by it. It's a really extraordinary place. So a poem. So thanks Lionel for coming in to read it.
I'm honored to be up here with people that I've only known from documentaries before, but who were important in my decision to go to Berkeley, and I thank you. This poem's called Greek Theater, and as Robbie mentioned, it has a right-hand column with footnotes, including footnotes to Robbie's book. Can you hear me now? Okay. Greek Theater. But in diverting the city's desires another way instead of complying with them, that is the only business of a good citizen. Plato, Georges. It has taken weeks of unsettled half-awareness for me to recognize the student wrestled to the ground by 6 policemen in uniforms, a baton menacing his neck and tie, an arm across his throat to keep him from speaking on the cover of this book about how J. Edgar Hoover slipped lies to the San Francisco Examiner, advancing the career of Ronald Reagan, is Mario Savio. On the stage of the Greek Theater, wrecking the well-planned closure of the assembly called to proclaim an end to the protests and sit-ins of the free speech movement and the inauguration of a new era of freedom under law by an ambitious professor, hoping thereby to become our next chancellor who defended the war on TV and is now less Googled than his daughter, the language poet. The anticlimax when Mario came back out to announce there would be a free speech rally on the Pless Hall steps upended my own planned life. I was just a few yards away at the same camera angle, one of those who had urged the students to trust the decency of those in power. My head then filled with Anglo-Latin verse from the 9th century, why the return of a cuckoo in spring spoke to the heart, expressing aspirations of friendship more deeply than Virgil could, and did more to invent Europe at a higher level, Christenus sum, non possum militare, than the battle stopping the Moors on the banks of the Loire. 2 different kinds of power, as I had seen in an iconic moment alone reading Plato's Georges, in the ambassador's huge bed when I was chargé d'affaires in Warsaw, the power of persuasion. And that of the nightstick, the first a traditio, so precious and fragile. I gave up all those frills, my chauffeur, that flag up ahead on the limo, to help preserve it in a university. Well, little could I foresee how Mario in an instant had changed me from a Latinist into an activist. No longer a mere spectator, as I had been 5 days earlier when the students filed into Pless Hall singing "We Shall Overcome." That same evening I spoke at the crisis faculty meeting, and only 1 month later, my first public appeal to get troops out of Vietnam, which, though I could not know it, was doomed to help end my evenings with Miloš, debating the right English for what is poetry that does not save nations or peoples. A heartbreaking loss at the time, but not one that deterred me as much as the crazy violence that broke out on all sides. The gates opened to a decade of tear gas, from filthy speech to prairie fire, and the struggle between 2 kinds of decency, one struggling for an end to racial hiring and the local supermarkets, one that of the US middle class who did not want their kids dropping acid or cursing America. So when given a chance, voted for Ronald Reagan, the great persuader who bankrupted Gorbachev, while Richard Oka, as a paid FBI informant, armed the Black Panthers. But once one has seen a student's cheek under a boot as an example of freedom under law, and a vivid pantomime on a political stage of the 2 kinds of power one has to choose between, the power of the internet versus the killer drone. Either the troops with DEA equipment who massacred dozens of students at Thammasat University in Bangkok, and the cop who thanked Howard Zinn for his talk to the police academy, then pled with him desperately to please leave the anti-war blockade before, a little later, battering him with an outsized club, or the power of nonviolence, which changed the American South and expelled Russian troops from Poland, encouraging me to search at the limits of language in the spirit of Mario for new Socratic energies, grounded on those hints of human freedom encoded in our DNA at a higher level than the Occupy movement, still struggling to break free from the habits of the past. Less than a year ago, led the US campus police to arrest my colleague Celeste Langen after dragging her 8 feet by her hair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lytle. Now we're going to hear via Zoom from Chancellor Carol Christ. I just wanted to say that first to thank her for taking the time to join us. I should also explain, I do a course on student activism in the long 1960s, and she zoomed into my class last semester, a little bit after the mass arrests here. And my students were, A, very excited because they had never met the president of their own university. It's the first time I think only one had ever been in the same room with the president of the university. So they're very excited to meet her. And also because she hadn't evicted the protesters or done any mass arrests out there, they were really hoping that she could consult with the administration here to kind of, illuminate the ways to preserve free speech when a controversial movement was going on. So they were very thrilled to meet her, and I think equally excited and gratified by having a chance to speak to her. So it's my pleasure to introduce Carol Christ, the 11th Chancellor of UC Berkeley. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Robbie. I'm delighted to be here. I wish I were there with you in person. I found the proceedings just so interesting, deeply, deeply interesting. So I'm going to talk about free speech during my chancellorship. I began my chancellorship and ended it with a crisis over free speech. They were quite different, and I will talk about each of them and talk about their differences. But first, I want to say that it is hard to overestimate how important free speech is to the identity of the Berkeley campus. The very popular cafe in the undergraduate library is called the Free Speech Cafe. It has pictures of the free speech movement, pictures of Mario Savio, that wonderful speech about the cogs of the machine on the walls. There are the Mario Savio steps currently in front of Sproul Hall. So free speech and Sproul Plaza is a place of free speech. So it's hard to overstate how important this legacy is at Berkeley, which doesn't mean at all that free speech is not controversial on occasion. And I want to talk about two of those occasions. I'm going to begin actually a little bit before I became chancellor, the spring of 2017, when a conservative student group invited Milo Yiannopoulos, kind of right-wing provocateur, to campus to speak. It was an evening in February, large crowd of students gathered on Sproul Plaza to protest his speaking. It was loud, it was large, but it was largely peaceful. And then shortly before the speech began, an armed formation of individuals dressed in black, masked, with weapons, not guns, but sticks, clubs, bricks, marched onto the plaza and started a riot. There were about 90 police officers there, but it was really insufficient to disband the protest, and without hurting students, which is, of course, something we never want to do. And so the police withdrew, and they evacuated Milo Yiannopoulos and the people who had come to hear him. And there was a riot of considerable heat. There was a fire, smashed windows, things like that. I became chancellor in the July 1st of 2017. And in my judgment, this, even though Milo Yiannopoulos, I found an abhorrent, had abhorrent views, I felt that it was tremendously damaging to the university, this home of free speech, to not allow a speaker to speak. And so I determined that I would use extraordinary resources to enable speakers to speak. The first test of this was I think of him as a kind of garden variety right-wing speaker named Ben Shapiro. He was invited by a conservative student group, And I engaged both enough police officers and used enough barriers to enable his speech to take place. It did take place. He came, he spoke, he was not interrupted, and he left. Then Milo Yiannopoulos announced that he was coming back, and coming back not just for a speech, as he had been invited to do the time before he was there in the spring, but rather something he called Free Speech Week. It had some 25 invited speakers and was going to be in a variety of venues, both inside and outside on the campus. Obviously a concern, but I was determined that Free Speech Week would take place. Again, in order to have to speak on the Berkeley campus, you have to be invited by a student group or some kind of organized body, a class, a professor, a student group, a school, a college. So there's a conservative student group invited him and invited this program, Free Speech Week. But as Free Speech Week approached, stranger and stranger things began to happen. First of all, the student group had signed none of the contracts, nor made any of the deposits that were required for the rooms that they were reserving. And it was past the deadline for those things. And then a number of the 25 speakers that were invited began, and the list of 25 was published on Milo Yiannopoulos' website, began getting in touch with the campus saying, we know nothing about this. We have not been invited. We have no intention of coming to the Berkeley campus. So something seemed rather suspicious to me. And I then decided to proceed on a hunch that what Milo Yiannopoulos was interested in doing was not having a Free Speech Week, but having us cancel Free Speech Week because we were concerned about the disruption. And then he would make of it something for himself on the web. So we decided to play a game of chicken and not cancel the event. And finally, the day before, I think it was 2 days before the event, Milo Yiannopoulos canceled the event. He did come to campus on a Sunday morning. Free Speech Week was supposed to begin on Monday. He spoke on Sproul Plaza. Maybe there were about 25 people there. He said the Pledge of Allegiance. He sang the national anthem. He prayed. It was all a rather clownish performance. And then that ended that. However, the campus was very distressed at that point. They were distressed by the police presence that I had used in order to enable the speakers to speak. And so I decided there had to be a process by which the campus could think deeply about free speech. And so I appointed a commission. It's called the Free Speech Commission. It was co-chaired by wonderful professor of philosophy, Jay Wallace, and Prudence Carter is the dean of the School of Education. They had hearings, open public hearings, and they issued a report on free speech that was, I think, still just a wonderful report. I mean, one of the things that you learn when you lead a university is that, the student population changes every 4 years. And so you need to constantly re-engage students with the things that are really important. So that was the first free speech crisis that I negotiated. Then in last spring, actually fall and spring, like many universities, we had many conflicts on our campus between demonstrations in support of Israel and demonstrations in support of Palestine and Gaza. There was an encampment on the Sproul steps in front of Sproul Hall. At its biggest, it was about 225 tents. There were also demonstrations in front of Sather Gate, which is the symbolic entrance to the campus right by Sproul Hall, in support, for the most part, of Palestine pretty much every day. And this was a time where, as you know well from NYU's experience, a number of my colleagues were using police to remove the encampments. My own experience of protests at Berkeley has shown me that bringing in the police to remove or disrupt a demonstration almost never works. And so I determined not to do that. The encampment was very orderly. It was peaceful. And then I started proceeding to negotiate with the leaders of the encampment. And we finally reached a negotiated settlement. The two free speech crises were very, very different. The first one, with which I began my term as chancellor, was about the right of a speaker that I will have to say was deeply unpopular, both of the speakers, but legitimately invited, defending the right of that speaker to speak undisrupted on campus. But it wasn't an issue that divided the student body for the most part. The second, the crisis about Israel and Palestine, was very different in the sense that there was student against student, faculty member against faculty member, staff member against staff member. It was deeply, deeply divisive for the community. And both Muslim students and Palestinian and pro-Palestinian students and Jewish students felt that their rights were being abused in the sense that they were being made to feel unwelcome and as if they did not belong on campus by the other side of the dispute. And in this, we can see the First Amendment conflicting with Title VI, which prohibits discrimination in institutions of higher education, also in other places as well, on the basis of racial identity, national origin, religion. So this was a very, I think that the steps that I took were the right ones for the campus in bringing the encampment to a peaceful end. What we agreed, just so you know what the terms of the agreement were, is that I would make a statement calling for ceasefire, that I would bring to a committee of our the Berkeley Foundation, which controls a portion of Berkeley's endowment, the proposal that they divest from stocks that are in companies whose main business is weapons manufacture, drone manufacture, and also the making of prison camps or refugee camps. That consideration is still ongoing. And I also agreed something that already had been the case, but I made it a public agreement, that any student could issue a discrimination complaint against any of our study abroad programs that discriminated on the basis of race or national origin or religion. So that is the story of these two free speech crises. Now the Board of Regents has changed the policy. If I were still chancellor, I would not have the freedom to act as I did in the spring, in the sense that the Board of Regents has made it clear that encampments not be tolerated and campus policies must be enforced. And the time, place, and manner rules have been made more strict than they had been. So that's what Berkeley's experience was in these rather tumultuous free speech years.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much, Chancellor. I hope you can stay around for the questions as well. Okay, our last speaker is Anne-Marie Garcia Jardine, who I should just say, by way of background, one of the things that the library dean said was that having a student speaker, they wanted to not have a student speaker because students lack the expertise to speak about issues. And I just thought that was, completely crazy, because those of us who have PhDs know that we did some of our best work when we were doctoral students. We didn't get puff, you're a tenured faculty, a junior faculty member, and you're smarter than you were as a doctoral student or as a graduate student. And also, I felt as if our job as professors is to help mentor our students so they can do presentations. So to say that our students lack the expertise, I mean, we're not supposed to hang it up as educators, right? That's our job, to make sure our graduate students and undergraduates too, because I've had undergraduates who've done presentations. That's part of what we're supposed to do. And I can assure you that Anne-Marie is very qualified to speak with great expertise about what happened at the University of Texas. So Anne-Marie, please come on.
Okay. Good evening, y'all. My name is Anne-Marie Jardine. I'm a University of Texas at Austin class of 2024 alumni. I'm a current student here at SPS in Global Affairs and Peace Building. And on April 24th, 2024, which was 6 months and 6 days ago, I was arrested on my own campus at UT Austin in my hometown of Austin, Texas. So on that day, our Palestinian Solidarity Committee planned a peaceful protest under the title Reclaim Our Space, with the common idea of divest from death, which means we want the university to stop spending money on weapon manufacturing companies and cut their ties related to the genocide against Palestinians. The schedule included activities like guest speakers, study breaks, learning about the student movement, pizza, and an art workshop, which was all set to conclude at 7 p.m. It's also worth noting that on that day, the sun was not set until 8:05 p.m., meaning we were going to be off campus before it was dark. We knew that we couldn't have another Columbia, so we didn't try. We knew people like Texas Governor Greg Abbott and former NYU Stern professor and now current president of UT, Jay Hartzell, would not allow us to exercise our freedom of speech in the same way our peers across the country can. We did exactly what our rules and guidelines allowed us and focused our energy on what mattered most, which was educating our community and doing our part to help Palestine. Despite popular misinformation spread by the news, politicians, and random people on the internet, this was not an encampment. The Texas government and police evicted a protest. We were not blocking roads or classes like reported either. The way April 24th unfolded wasn't simply just infringements on our First Amendment rights. We were targeted for standing up against what UT is doing and for our support of Palestine. Jay Hartzell himself demonized us and plotted an attack before we had even stepped on campus that day, as his leaked text towards Texas senators reaffirmed. We were constantly accused of being anti-Semitic, hate-filled, and dangerous group of students. However, none of this is true, and our demands were clear. We wanted UT to divest from this war, a permanent ceasefire, and an end to the genocide. On April 24th, after I had been hit in the stomach multiple times with a baton, I was randomly plucked from the crowd that gathered for this peaceful teach-in to support Gaza on the South Lawn by UTPD officer Chad Martinka, soon followed by 12 other UT police officers yanking me to the ground. They dragged me by my hair and arm for multiple yards to throw me face down to the dirt to arrest me. I was pinned down with Officer Martinka's entire body on top of me and with his knee on my neck. And honestly, I felt like a zoo animal. So I then spent 17 hours in Travis County Jail, where I was denied medical care for the open bleeding wounds caused by state troopers that I now have permanent scars on my leg from. I was denied drinking water. I was forced to sit in my period-stained clothing and period blood. I was also denied period products, and I received no sanitary or hygiene products, not even soap. So I was forced to have dried period blood and then just dried blood from my wounds on my body and hands for hours. The day of my release, I didn't even have time to process what I endured because I had to go take my last final of my undergraduate degree. After my final, I went to the hospital. I had a sprained neck and arm, swollen ribs, and a strained lower back. The doctor had assumed that I was in a car accident because of the severity of my injuries that I sustained by the hands of UTPD and DPS. All because I chose to exercise my First Amendment right to protest their compliance in the genocide against Palestinians. What was planned to be a peaceful protest meant to amplify Palestinian cries left students like me battered and bruised because of the exact apartheid we are fighting would rather brutalize us than fix the injustice they are creating. My arrest video, my photo, my mugshot, my full name, my phone number, and my address were all leaked on the internet and were posted by multiple far-right news organizations. It got so out of hand that these far-right extremists actually reached out to NYU and flooded my LinkedIn to try to get my admission reversed, which obviously did not work. But I was subject to a grueling disciplinary process from UT Austin that had a sorry excuse of due process this summer, resulting in me never getting my physical diploma. And they said I can never take classes with them again. Now that I have had 6 months and 6 days to reflect on this injustice, my feelings remain the same. I am just as confused, hurt, angry, and tired. Free speech is not free for everyone. In 2019, there was a bill signed that, quote, will protect free speech on college campuses, that will let students assemble without permits and also allows for distribution of material. Any guesses who strongly advocated for it? Would you believe me if I said it was Texas Governor Greg Abbott? I know. A man who once prides himself on being the free speech defender is now ordering universities to reverse and tighten free speech policies. Free speech is only a right for those who agree with people like Jay Hartzell, Greg Abbott, and other oppressive right-wing governments. Hold on, my page got stuck. Okay. My experience at UT and their blatant violation of my First Amendment right is unfortunately nothing new. Despite these incidents being 60 years apart, the free speech movement and the protests last semester show the lengths universities will go to try to suppress student voices and student rights. These institutions target marginalized people in groups who dare to fight for a better world. Places like UT Austin prioritize their pro-war donors to the point that they suppress their students' free speech. When we speak against genocide and UT Austin and Texas's involvement with it, we are met with unnecessary violence. It is also no wonder that they are now ranked the 8th worst university for free speech in the United States, according to College Pulse. I will never forget the violence they used against me, my fellow UT classmates, and my community members. I will never forget how they put their own personal interest over the sanctity of free speech, the country of Palestine, and their citizens. We will never forget how they not only armed this genocide, but gladly brutalized their own students and faculty to appease the status quo, Israel and Netanyahu. My beautiful home state of Texas likes to think of itself as unique, the Lone Star State. But my experience of being violently arrested on my own campus last semester for peacefully protesting a war is not unique to Texas. It is far from it. The New York Times reported that more than 3,000 anti-war protesters were arrested on college campuses last semester from coast to coast. This was a higher campus arrest rate than most any time in the 1960s, even though most of the protests last semester were far less disruptive than those during the Vietnam student protests. Too often, as Professor Cohen wrote in his LA Times op-ed, last semester, mass arrests were often used as a first rather than last resort, attesting to the erosion of free speech on many campuses. On behalf of the 3,000 plus students who anti-war protests were met with police invasions on campuses, I end by calling for a new free speech movement that can restore the freedoms Berkeley students won back in 1964, so that the First Amendment, rather than police helmets and zip ties, will prevail on campuses and dissent will be respected, not repressed in the US. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Anne Marie. Okay. Okay. We have some time for some questions. The people, I think I have to go around with the microphone. Anybody have any questions for any of the people here? Go ahead first. Go ahead.
My name is Samuel Farber. I was a rank and file member of the free speech movement back in '64. I was then a graduate student in sociology. And I have little time. I would like to speak about what's going on today, but I have to use my little time to what I know personally. I think that there is an impression that exists that this was a liberal movement. And I think that's, in my opinion, a mistaken notion. I think that it's certainly true that the majority of the people who began in September of '64 were liberals, but there was a transformation taking place as a result of the movement where people were radicalized. And therefore, if I had to give a name to that movement, which is not necessary, but sometimes it's helpful, I would call it the radical democratic movement, in which socialists played a substantial role. The leadership was radical and many socialists involved in it. Myself, I was a member of the Independent Socialist Club, rank and file member of it. Bettina was the leader of the Du Bois Club. There was also the Young Socialist Alliance. And there were dozens, particularly graduate students, who were independent socialists, because Berkeley had become a pole of attraction for radicals to come there. That's one point. The other point, very briefly, is that there was a radical current taking place in the United States at that time. A lot of the people who were active in the free speech movement had just come out, including Mario Savio, of course, of the Mississippi Freedom Summer. That summer, there was a convention in Atlantic City where the Democratic Party refused to seat the delegation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So you have a process of radicalization going on, of which we were a part. And the process of radicalization that challenged liberalism rather than join it, because liberalism was opposed always, in my experience, to direct action. And if there's one thing that characterized all these movements was direct action. And that's why after that, as a result of that experience, the people who came in as liberals became radical. I remember, and I'll be finishing in a second, I remember that I arrived to Berkeley in '63. And there were civil rights demonstrations Bettina was speaking about, also in Jack London Square in Oakland. And I remember that more or less, I knew everybody by sight that came to those rallies, a couple hundred people. After the FSM, I didn't know people anymore. It was a tremendous, fantastic problem to have, that you no longer could recognize the radicals on campus. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to get to you in a second. I just want to mention that my old professor, Leon Litwack, talked about that during the McCarthy era. He was there during the Cold War era. There was a detective who took pictures of all the radicals at the demonstration. They're so small that they could monitor them. And then after the free speech movement, he felt that poor detective, I've forgotten his name, was sort of lost because on the plaza there were like thousands of people, and he didn't know how to take pictures of all the people that were there because he couldn't. It was no longer a small group. It was massive. So he looked kind of lost. Okay, you had a question over there? The mic over here.
Hi. So I just want to say too, before I ask my question, I work at Bopes and we share your sentiment. We hate those guys at the top floor. They like hog the elevator. It's horrible. But so my question more so, I think it's for Carol. With a lot of what we've talked about today, it seems like these decisions to send in the police and send in these kind of more authoritative figures only like pisses more people off. It doesn't seem to help the situation at all. So I really want to know, kind of based on my own experience here over last winter and last spring, like the administration seems like it's just big brother just looking down on you and there's no real relationship there. So how are these decisions made to send in the police? Like, you know, because we see that it doesn't really solve anything. It just makes these more volatile situations. Like, what reasoning is there to do that?
It's complicated. I mean, I've made another set of decisions, so I can't really get into the heads of, you know, people who chose differently. Sometimes the reasoning that's given is to protect public safety. Sometimes it results from pressure from either government officials or from the government of the university itself that's beyond the president, boards of trustees, for example, or boards of regents. So I myself don't think that, I mean, as you implied in your question or said in your question, I myself don't think it's usually an effective way of ending such a protest. It tends to grow the protest. So I agree with you, but there are. It's hard for me to explain, you know, the basis of an action that I didn't take.
Did you, I just want to follow up on that. Did you come under a lot of pressure when you were not arresting people to go ahead? Did the regents or anybody, did you come under pressure or people threaten your job that if you didn't send in the police and evict the encampment that you would lose your chancellorship, although you were almost at the end of your term? I guess that
I was in a very good place to take an action like that, and that I had already announced my retirement. I was, you know, how many weeks? 6 weeks, 7 weeks from retirement. It really, I didn't feel vulnerable in that way.
Thank you. Okay, other questions? Barbara.
On that question, it seems to me, both on the part of the students and the deans, that they're living in a time when, I mean, being the captain of the bureaucracy, remember, Clarker was very good at it. If the regents hadn't kept saying, no, we won't talk to the students, no, you must expel them, I think he could have possibly, well, also, but there was Mario and Bettina, and we were pretty sharp too, but okay, he could have succeeded, and people can succeed now, but it seems to be somewhat beneficial to them rather than harmful to them. They don't want to be seen as the people that can keep the thing quiet. Some at least want to be seen as the person that is ready to come down on the students and stop any action quickly. Well, that's just, you know, a different world they're living in where they're judged differently. By the way, I would also say the students also are aiming their activities off campus. Very often they're not, you know, seeing what they can get on, you know, the students seem to rise to an action much quicker too. So the times have just changed, but I really think I give those deans credit. They could think of some way in the current world to cool it, but it doesn't seem to be in their interest to cool it. They want to show that they too can be firm. That's what I think. I'm not certain. You know more of them than I do.
We're staying late already. Here, let me give you the microphone.
Hi, just to follow up from that, to what extent is the influence of the donors for these universities implicated in this problem? Anybody who wants to answer it?
Hold on a second, Bettina. Okay. Yeah. That's okay. It's good exercise.
So I think apropos of the question, but also of what Barbara was saying, this is a different era, and donors have put tremendous pressure on administrations to nip protests in the bud, so to speak, and which is what happened in Austin. Although Greg Abbott may have yet another agenda there, but to stop any kind of protest from happening at all. And I think that's and the fact that administrations will cave so quickly to that kind of pressure from donors is very chilling. It's very chilling that that's the case, because the university should be free of a certain kind of political pressure like that, whether it comes from a state legislature or it comes from donors. Part of what should happen is that there should be an understanding that the donor is donating for the benefit of education and not for the benefit of their particular views. And I don't think you have that. If I could say just one other thing, because my friend here, when you were talking about they could photograph, they could take pictures of the radicals then, I just want to say, in the aftermath of the free speech movement, I had an FBI agent who was following me the entire time I was in Berkeley. And he came to my house when I first got to Berkeley, and he introduced himself. And he knocked on the door, and he introduced himself, and I wouldn't open, I wouldn't open the screen door, because after all, I was the daughter of a communist, so I knew. So he said, "My name is Donald Jones, and it'll go easier for you if you cooperate with me." And I said an expletive that I won't repeat here, and I closed the door. During the end of the free speech movement, during our rally that we were having while we were on trial, all of us were on trial. There was a mass trial after we had been arrested. I spotted him in the back of the crowd, and I got my almost husband. We weren't yet married, but I called him over. I said, "Jack, that's Donald Jones. He's right there. Go stand next to him." And so he stood next to him, and then I introduced Donald Jones to the crowd, which was several thousand people, and I invited him to come up and speak because we believed in freedom of speech. And everybody ran over and took his picture. So he had his picture posted everywhere, and that was sort of the end of his career as an agent in Berkeley. But a few days later, I was walking to the post office in Berkeley, and I hear this voice from a car, and he's yelling, "There she is, there's the communist." And I looked around, and there was Donald Jones in his car. And this woman came over and put her arm around me, and she said, "Some men are just crazy."
That's a great story. Very good. Very good. I just wanted to mention that there also was pressure from Congress. If you remember that the Stefanik hearings that led to the president of Harvard and Penn being pressured out of office, and then I think the way that the universities work is that there's a pecking order, and if the president of Harvard could get pressured out of office for not suppressing the movement, anybody can. And that had a chilling effect. So it wasn't just the donors. And I guess the other thing I want to say is, my view is that because in sort of Trumpist America, people in power are much more crudely open about being politically repressive. Even Ronald Reagan, when he fired Clark, he got Clark Kerr fired for not suppressing the free speech movement, tried to do it covertly and denied. He was lying, but he denied. He knew that it was wrong to publicly pull strings to fire a president of the university. So he wouldn't like boast about it, or like Stefanik saying 3 down, 1 down, 2 to go, whatever. So I think that the right has become much cruder about this. And so that puts an additional pressure on the presidents aside from the donors. And it's very, very explicit, especially with the movement here, that the idea is, well, you're creating this movement with anti-Semitism and with terrorism. So people, donors are very proud to suppress this. They're not really thinking about the free speech issue. They're thinking about this very, very unpopular movement. And the last thing I would say is, to me, unpopular movements are the kind of canary in the coal field. Popular expression is not the problem. It's, most of the things that especially the left has done in American history, whether it's labor organizing or civil rights organizing or peace organizing, challenges wide consensus in American society. And if you can suppress those, and you may not like this movement, but you may be a part of the next one. So I think it's extremely dangerous, and is, I think, a failure in many, many universities, unlike what Carol Christ did, to stand up for free speech and academic freedom. Because if chancellors and college presidents won't do that, then who is? We are, but you need a whole movement to have the power to push back on that. Anyway, we're out of time. Thank you so much for coming, and thank all our guests for speaking, and thank you very much.
Thank you.